As Kinga said, I'm Laura Lunsford, and I'm very happy to be here, so thank you for the invitation, and I had great research visits yesterday. I've been in Germany since April 1, and I'm studying on mentoring there, and what I wanted to do in this talk is share some of my research with you about mentoring and some changes and turns in the road that I have made, and sort of where I'm thinking to go in the future. It would help me to know a little bit about the audience. I met many of you yesterday and some of you today. Could you just tell me, are you all from this, what do you call it, department, college? Institute? Who is not? Could you tell me where you're from and what your interest in mentoring is?
Well, I'm Kieran. I'm from South Africa. I've been studying a master's degree in educational science. I help to train and coach English as a second language teachers, along with teaching foreign students, and that takes on the role of mentoring, because you don't teach language, you teach life.
Thank you.
I'm also a Canon. I am from the other institute, Institute of Education, and my main field is teacher education and higher education pedagogy, so I'm interested in mentoring as well.
Thank you. And I met on anyone else not from this institute? Yes, tell us where you're from.
I'm a secondary school student and a mentoring teacher, and not far from here. My school is not far from here, but the bell rang 2 minutes ago.
Well, we're just getting started. I'm glad you're here. Yes.
I'm Neil Sadar. I'm a PhD student from the Institute of Education. My research is connected with the collaborative learning of teachers and their professional development.
Oh, wonderful. Well, I hope you'll have some good questions for me at the end. I'm from the southern part of the United States, where we supposedly speak slowly, but I tend to speak very quickly. So I'm going to try to speak slowly. Raise your hand if I get going too fast. I also will not be troubled if you wish to ask a question during my presentation. You don't need to wait until the end. I know people are different about that. When I started my dissertation, I spent about a whole summer thinking about an interesting topic that I wouldn't get bored with. And every 2 weeks I would pick a new topic and I would either solve it in my mind from the research or decide that it wasn't that interesting to keep working on. But I met a colleague at the American Psychological Association who studied gifted students. Her name is Rena Sabatnik. I know some of you know her. And we got to talking about mentoring. And I decided that this was a very interesting topic. And at that time, almost, it's hard to believe, over 20 years ago, there really wasn't a lot of literature about mentoring other than in the organizational literature. And here is what we knew. From that literature, there was some information about how we match people might be important, that it was important to have some sort of goals. Again, this was in a workplace setting that most of this literature had been written. And we knew that there were some outcomes that seemed important. People were more satisfied. They were more likely to be retained at their workplace, which is important because does anyone know how much it costs? The estimates are to replace someone. Like how much times your salary? People in business know this number, 1.5 times your salary. So if you're a business, you care a lot because it's very expensive to replace someone, especially if they make a lot of money or they're a professional person like a doctor or professor. Mentoring was also associated with promotions and then, of course, not surprisingly, salary. This will be correlated. And there was some work on academic achievement in college. Because a lot of that literature had been done in business literature, they didn't talk a lot about the processes of it. Now, I'm a psychologist, so I was very interested in, well, what's going on inside of that? And I remember having conversations with my advisor about, well, did it matter what discipline you're in? Does mentoring look different in education than if you are in physics, for example? How much did the conditions matter? Well, this set me on a journey, and I wanted to share with you 4 studies where I tried to understand what's in that black box. And as I shared with Ann before I started, I found this painting actually in Regensburg, Germany. It's by Eastern European. There's a museum there, Jan. And his is turned the other way, but I turned it this way. How do you say his last name?
Kubicek.
Thank you. I knew I wouldn't get it quite right. And I decided he was also talking about mentoring in his painting, so I'd like to use it here. Very little work had been done on what the actual behaviors were that were related to mentoring. Like, what are people actually doing? So in this study, I had graduate students, PhD doctoral students, at 2 different institutions, almost 500 people, who had been in the school for at least 3 years. So they had, in the US, you are in graduate school longer than here, so it's the average, it's supposed to be 4, but it's usually the average is 5 or 6 years. So they had time to have a relationship, a mentoring relationship with their advisor, because I was so interested in these behaviors. It was across disciplines. So I had all the disciplines that these research universities had. There were 2. And my question was, how are these variables related? So I've highlighted a couple of things that I think are interesting for us to think about as we think about mentoring. Some of you may know Kathy Cram first identified these 2 types of behaviors, these categories: psychosocial, which is more like friend support, role modeling, confidence building, and then career support, or what she called instrumental support, that has to do more with the discipline, like what's the interesting question, what conferences should you attend, how to navigate your field. And the blue shows you that these 2 functions are highly correlated. Because the question I still have, and one of the ones we're looking at in the study I'm doing at Regensburg, is which comes first? Do you need to have psychosocial, some level of trust first before you're going to listen to the career? But on the other hand, I've also studied highly gifted or highly talented students, and sometimes they want to get right to business. And so, is it necessary it comes first? Either way, they're highly correlated, which presents some problems from an analysis point of view because of multicollinearity. If they're so related, it's hard to tease some of this out. I also want to point out, did they think their advisor is a mentor? And this was also quite correlated, which is what you would hope, that the more they receive those 2 kinds of support, and the under 9 there, those top 2, the more they thought their advisor was a mentor. And up until this time, and Kathy Cram helped me a lot here, most people assume that if you're in a mentoring program, you have a mentor. But that would be a wrong assumption. And she actually suggested I have a scale for students to select the extent to which they felt their advisor would be a mentor to them. And remarkably, many students did not think of their advisor as a mentor. And I found this sense in many programs. So just because people are in a program or have been assigned doesn't mean that they think it's actually taking place. And as you can see, it's also mentoring and this advisor as a mentor is related to some outcomes, because I wanted to know it's not enough just to feel nice satisfaction, but do they actually publish more or present more, or do they do a better job on these outcomes? It ends up that career and psychosocial support, they had an interaction, they're highly correlated, and they did predict satisfaction. These are odds ratios, which means essentially for each unit you move up and thinking that your advisor is a mentor, you are 70% more likely to be higher in satisfaction. But it was career mentoring that predicted behaviors, and it was only presentations that was significant in this case. But the odds ratio is 40%, so for each unit you think your advisor provides more mentoring, you're 40% more likely to have a presentation, which in graduate school we think will lead to publications. Now these were not very advanced students, so not everyone had a lot of publications, but I was trying to kind of tie this to outcomes. Here's some sample items. There's 3 items here for the career mentoring. I use the Advisor Working Alliance Inventory to measure this, and I want you to pick which one of those 3 items you think is much more likely to lead to the presentation or some outcomes. the timetable, collaborator, or recognizing areas. All right, I have a vote for 2. Who feels like number 1 would probably be pretty important? Yeah, it seems like being organized and so forth is important. How about number 2? Collaboration, got some support. How about number 3? Do they recognize areas? Okay, so I asked you this question because trained as a social psychologist, once I show you the answer, you'll all say it's obvious, right? But you've all had different answers, so this is why this is why we do research. It ends up it was collaboration. Was the important behavior. And I've since found this in lots of other studies. So it seems that people need to have something around which they're doing, and it propels that relationship forward. Especially if people maybe aren't as skilled at being a mentor, it gives them a way to engage. I said, okay, so collaboration seems really important. We can tie some behaviors to outcomes, but what about these processes? Like what's happening that makes people want to be in high quality relationships? So this study, I had 3 different cohorts, 3 years of highly gifted college students. They'd all been participating in a mentoring program for 3 years. So they're what we call juniors, but it was their 3rd year out of 4. So we had 4 years in undergraduate study in the US. And here, it was career identity. So the more a student felt like they were certain about what their career was, the more likely they reported having a good mentor. And here's a table that kind of makes that point. So the students were all interviewed, and these interviews were all coded. And they went from, again, remember, they're all in a mentoring program, and yet 5 of them said, well, I don't really see that person. So we go to them as they did not have a mentor. Or average, fortunately, most people were good. But the more likely they were certain on their career, the more likely they were reporting having a good relationship with their mentor. Now, there are some people who, and you can see no plan, so the less likely towards the right of the chart, they didn't really have a plan about their career. They weren't sure what they were going to do. They were less likely. And we could theorize, why might this be? Well, if they're not very sure, they might not want to waste a professor's time meeting about, say, engineering. If I'm not really sure I want to do that. And so I kind of sit back and rather than, so they had the option, they could change mentors. They could come talk to the program director and say, I found another mentor. So it's just sort of interesting that those who were quite uncertain, it was related to their mentoring relationship. Now, some of you who study mentoring might tie some of this to identity development. And I think a lot of mentoring is rooted in psychosocial theory, Erickson's theory, and in fact, Kathy Graham used that when she studied mentoring. And I think it's quite relevant here at these pivot points of developing identity. Then I became quite interested in, well, how do these faculty learn to mentor others? And I'm showing you studies from higher education because it's a setting that we're all quite familiar with, so it's easier to understand what might be happening. Are you familiar with the term memes? It's sort of like, the cultural DNA. And I have some colleagues in California who also were quite interested in these memes. I think they coined that term, mentoring memes. And my question was, well, how do faculty learn to mentor others? And in this study, I was in Australia and was following up on a previous study about academic linkages. In other words, how linked are you? Is it related to how prolific you are in publications and presentations? And some of these scientists had agreed to be interviewed. So I interviewed 23 of them, again, across disciplines, because I'm sort of still very interested in, is it different? Is it different in different disciplines? Do we need to think about it differently? And I asked them questions such as the following. I never used the word mentoring in introducing the study to them or in any of the questions, but instead I would ask them about their different levels. First, when you were an undergraduate, who provided support to you? Describe the kind of support that they provided, because I wanted to code that. Is it psychosocial? Is it career? Who are these people? And the same for graduate, postgraduate. Australia has a 4th honors year that undergraduates do if they're going to go into graduate school. So this was another period. So I asked them undergraduate, honors, PhD, postdoc, and currently. And then I asked them, what about their current students? How are they supporting them, and could they tell me how they engage with their students? What was interesting about this study is these scientists were quite eminent in their field, and in fact, the very first one, I became a little nervous knocking on their door. I'm a very confident person normally, as my husband will tell you, but I'm knocking on the door, and I'm realizing on the door is a cover of the Economist magazine. And on the cover, I'm reading it, is the professor I'm to interview. And all of a sudden I think to myself, why is this guy going to want to talk to me just, freshly out of graduate school about mentoring? Well, unfortunately or fortunately, he opened the door before I could depart and consult further, like, are you sure these are the people I should be talking to? And he was very interesting because it was a qualitative research project. He invited me in. He was quite kind with his time. But he said, well, how does this work? Do I just start talking? I said, well, it is a science, social science. So I have a set of questions. But if you want to start talking, I'll, ask you the questions you don't answer. Well, he agreed to my protocol, and I got to go first. And what was interesting is that many of these people did not have mentors. 14, 2/3 of them. So these are all very eminent people, but only 14 reported mentors, 2/3, when they came through their studies. And they all talked about emulating their mentors, or in the case of some of them who said they did not have a good advisor or mentor, they would report doing the opposite of what they got. So you can even learn from bad behaviors. And the developmental window, like when those relationships seemed to be the closest, was in their honors year. So perhaps the developmental window idea is that there might be times when you have interventions that matter more, that it can put you on a trajectory that would be different. And it seemed to be the case for that undergraduate period. So this timing of mentor appearance, so you can see 9 of them never felt they had anyone who supported them. And then I coded how they talked about their interactions with their students, if they were positive or challenging interactions. And here's sort of what's interesting. 1/4 of them reported challenging interactions, even though I never asked for that. I just would say things like, tell me about how you supported your students. And some were quite dysfunction, but more challenging interactions were experienced by the people who never had mentors. Now we can think about this and say, well, perhaps there's some personality trait related to why they were not attractive to be mentored and why they now have more difficulty than other people. That's possible. It's also possible that having had no mentor, they really never developed a good skill set to manage those. It's still a bit unclear. But what's interesting is that when you're starting to talk about what's happening in these relationships, where do they learn how to pass this along? It was from mentors, but some of them don't have them. And these can be sort of negative repercussions for the students they're mentoring. I became quite interested in this idea of quality because mentoring relationships, like other relationships, vary from positively horrible to really fantastic. I mean, just like other relationships we have in our life, spouses, friendships, why should mentoring be any different? But if we're going to have a formal mentoring program and put all the time and effort and expect people to engage, wouldn't you want it to be great? Like if it's going to be average, leave them to their own devices. And certainly if it's going to be terrible. So I became quite interested in what is high quality mentoring. So this is a study of over 400 faculty members at a liberal arts consortium of colleges. So there were 9 different colleges. And we surveyed them across ranks. So in the US we have assistant as the first rank, associate and full. And we asked them a lot of survey questions about, in the last year, have you mentored someone? Has someone mentored you? We defined what that term meant and so forth. And then we also looked at, we created a measure of relationship quality. Relationship quality is a bit confusing in the literature because sometimes it's considered an outcome. We measure relationship satisfaction, which I think perhaps is not the right way to think about it because it's the relationship itself. It's a little iterative, like you're measuring the thing that you're saying is producing things. So what makes it high quality? And the measure we drew on was from the work out of the University of Michigan on positive organizational behavior. She talks about tensility, so it's like resilience, the extent to which you can come back together after a challenging interaction. And you probably all had that. Some of my students have that. They get some, critical feedback from me. Maybe they don't want to see me for a couple of days, but hopefully they come back. This is tensility. Another one is openness. So the extent to which someone connects you with new ideas or new people, new ways of thinking. The literature is pretty clear that if you have multiple mentors, but they're all from the same perspective, you don't really have multiple mentors. So part of the goal is to have people who have different access to different information. And finally is emotional tone. The extent to which you can express positive or negative feelings in the mentoring relationship. Like, I did this presentation and I think I really bombed. How could I fix that? Or, wow, I finally got revise and resubmit on an article, whatever that is. So we use that measure and also a validated measure of job satisfaction. And what we found was that, because most studies just say, did you have a mentor and are you satisfied? And we found a significant effect. So that's the model one. Gender didn't, actually there was an option for gender if they didn't have to report their gender. And those people were not very happy. We're not sure why that is. We're wondering why didn't they want to report their gender, what's happening. This is before gender became such a big deal in the United States especially, but for some reason those people maybe felt like they could be identified and they were then happy people. I'm not sure. But having a protege, this is just one of them. So regression results for having a protege in relationship quality. It predicted 0.07. But when we added the quality of the relationship, it increased the R squared, the variance predicted on satisfaction. And we care about job satisfaction because it means those faculty are more likely to stay in the job if they're higher in satisfaction. Now you all probably know that mentoring has small effect sizes in the literature. So it's a small but often significant effect. So being able to explain a little bit more of that by controlling for, was it high quality or low quality? Because if it's low quality mentoring, we might not expect it to have the same kind of benefits. And this held true either way they were, whether they were the mentor or whether they were being mentored. When we put in relationship quality, we were able to explain more of their job satisfaction. How are we doing? Okay? Okay, so we looked at behaviors. Collaboration seemed to be important. Career identity seems to matter. How do people learn it? Well, some people don't even have mentors. You can learn from their absence. Quality seems to matter when we're trying to look at some outcomes. So I've been trying to peer into this black box. And then something happened. I was at the University of Arizona at the time, and a colleague of mine in education recruited me to write a grant with her to create more STEM, science, and math teachers in the borderlands region of Arizona. I don't think you have anything in Europe that is quite like the borderland region of Arizona. So you can imagine a vast county that is bigger than some of our states. I actually looked up to Hungary. It's maybe like a third of the size of Hungary, this particular county. But it's very rural, and of course, it's on the border to Mexico. So especially along the border, you have many students who are Mexican American. And they're not people who came across, they've been living there. It's like the border moved on them. Okay, so people sometimes in the US get a little confused about that point. Here it is. Here's the county, Cochise County in the corner. Arizona is a very big state. And she asked me to help create a mentoring program. And I said, well, how hard can this be? I've been studying mentoring, right? It's not that hard. I began to look at resources, and the only resources I could find about mentoring programs, there were two. One was in teacher education, and it was a center out of the University of California, Santa Cruz. And all they did is help people be better mentors. They actually didn't do the program part. And then there was a small book, but for workplace mentoring, that had some basic ideas about how to create a workplace mentoring program. So we located virtually no resources on creating a mentoring program. And so now, you get a grant sometimes and you're very excited, and then we were terrified because we were like, well, how's this going to work in a very rural location? All of the teachers who teach science and math in this county were Anglo, or what we would call white. In Arizona, they call them Anglo. But 99% of the schools along the border were Mexican-American students. We thought, well, we'll do it online. And then we went to visit one of the schools. I think I shared this with you guys yesterday. They said they had internet. We're like, great, but I have learned by now not to, trust but verify. So we go to the school, and I'm like, great, what's your internet password? And they're like, good question. No one knew it. There was actually one password that they all shared, and none of the teachers could remember it, and the IT person wasn't there. So while they had internet, they effectively did not have internet. And we realized we can't do an online program if this is the situation. Same with TV. We had like interactive television. We were like, great, let's turn it on. Let's see if it's working. No, it wasn't working. So we brought them together in a hybrid program. We paid the teachers to come together, and we worked on preparing the mentors for reflection. Because we quickly realized, even when I examined what they had been using, and I'm sure you have something similar here, a mentor teacher goes and observes someone in the classroom, and at the bottom of this form, they were supposed to write a reflection question for the mentee to think about. When we analyzed that, half of those questions were statements. They weren't even questions. And most of the statements were very judgmental, like, you should think about doing this more. So I'm like, okay, they're not getting the idea of mentoring. They're bossy, they're judging. Even when you say, write a question, they're having trouble doing that. We also realized that mentors and student teachers didn't understand Mexican-American culture. So students were actually asking the janitorial staff, who were Mexican-American, like, how should they refer to their students? It was just very interesting that they thought it was a bit impolite, the Anglo teachers did, to discuss this. And the problem is it led to wrong attributions of student motivation. So in Mexican-American culture, holidays are a very big deal. Family gatherings are a very big deal. And one misses school for those. Because the Mexican-American holidays are not United States holidays. But teachers then would go, well, they're not committed to school. And then they would sort of make these judgments that would influence how they would respond to students in the classroom. So we found a pretty big gap between even the university, the school norms, and the local cultural norms. But we also learned how to create a program and to think very specifically about establishing goals, preparing people to enter into those relationships. And this got me into the program business. Here's another program. I'm just going to mention two of them. There have been a variety now that have been grant funded. This was for visually impaired students in STEM, again, trying to increase interest in science and math. And they had people working in industry who were visually impaired. Have any of you ever been around visually impaired students? It was very interesting and quite different than deaf culture. So my colleague is also visually impaired, and I had assumed there's a culture of visual impairment. No, it is not the same because they don't share language, for example, whereas deaf students do. So we took them up to the top of this big mountain. They were engaged in science activities. They had mentors from industry who were visually impaired, and they had university mentors who were sighted only because we couldn't find any university mentors who were visually impaired. And the question was, we knew we needed to prepare them for these relationships, and this is where I got quite interested in mentorship education. Because the challenge is, a video is not all that interesting if you are visually impaired. Which, when you're sighted, it's kind of interesting. You see the person, you hear their inflection. We ended up doing podcasts with conversations between people so that they can listen to them. And what this is presenting is we had 8 podcasts based some on Chris Funn's work that we were talking about yesterday, Kinga, on what is the right information people need. So, and this is how much they listen to it. So getting started, developing high quality relationship, what does that look like? Assessing understanding, so how do you know that somebody understood what you were just talking about? Establishing expectations, or what we might call goal setting for these relationships. Mentoring ethically. I think they talk more in Europe about ethics than they do in the United States in terms of mentoring. That's starting to change, and the professional organizations in the US have signed on to the European Mentoring and Coaching Council's ethical statements about mentoring. So we felt it was very important to help them understand that. And then we added some things that weren't always in mentorship education. It's like, how do you learn about visual impairment? So for example, our sighted mentors wondered, what if I say, do you see what I'm saying? Like, should I be worried about that? So we discussed that because we said they can't see your face, they hear your tone, and they might think you're reacting that way because you are worried about what you just said, but they might think that they did something wrong. So we discussed how can you use language, how do you communicate with people with visual impairments, and then about project-based learning, because this program had very cool projects that they would work on with their mentors. Again, you see this idea, there's something they can collaborate on. In Arizona, there is a very big crater of a meteor. They call it meteor crater. They're not very creative in their nomenclature. But one of the scientists on the team actually made a 3D printed version of the meteor crater. And the students could feel it, and they would do science around like how big is it. I mean, I felt it, I couldn't tell anything, but they were fantastic being able to answer lots of questions about meteor crater with the model. So they each got a model, for example, and their mentors would work with them. What's important about this project is, well, could they retain any of this information? And so we had a knowledge quiz at the end of the training. And they all did really well. So the 67 was an outlier, and this was one of our undergraduate mentors actually. All the mentors in industry scored 88 or higher, so they were able to retain the information. And here's a representative item. You know, the best time to talk about expectations in the relationship is. And we tried to have questions that sounded possible, like after you get started, it's better to figure out what you need to get to know each other first, or should you talk about it in the very first meeting? So we really were assessing, could they get it? This work led to being involved in the National Academies of Science project that happened, I think we ended it up in 2019. The National Academies convened consensus studies in the United States to study topics, and no one had really studied effective mentorship. And so I was on a disciplinary team, 2 psychologists and then people from other fields, physics, chemistry, medicine, etc. And we pulled together all the research to talk about, again, what does it look like effective? What is high quality or effective mentorship in this area? And again, now you should be prepared to go, okay, identity. Identity was really important, and how you develop a career identity is essential, and who your personal identity is important for people to recognize that. And then this notion of mentorship education. So in the United States, probably 15 years ago, they started talking much more about teaching as a skill. That you're not born a teacher, it's a skill, you can learn it. But mentoring isn't talked about like that. We sort of invisibly learn it. And maybe if you had someone good, you learned it well, and if not, good luck. So we really have pushed the idea that mentorship is like teaching, it's a skill, and it can be developed, and certainly some people are more skillful at it than others, but we have a pretty good idea about what should be in that skill set. This book ended up being one of the most downloaded reports of the National Academies, and there's an online companion resource, so perhaps we can make sure to share the slides because I have the link here. So if you're interested in mentoring, there's lots of information, including a definition. I'm curious as to what your definitions are. You do all this mentoring, what do you think mentoring is? I know you didn't know that I was going to be calling on you.
Supporting, well, for me, I guess, supporting new teachers or teachers who have just entered the profession.
Okay, so this idea of sort of supporting and maybe guiding.
I don't know.
Okay. Anyone else?
Thinking together.
What is it?
Thinking together.
I like that. Thinking together. Thinking about what?
offer or his career or plans or
Okay.
anything that matters for her or him.
Okay, so kind of thinking about what their goals are and what
Yes.
matters and talking about that. Here, we have lots of, I'll say, spirited discussions about, I don't know if you know the expression, putting a stake in the sand or a flag in the sand, because there's not been a generally accepted definition of mentoring. So we decided that if we're going to do this big report for 2 years, we should come up with one. And so here it is. And the reason I like the together business is, especially in the United States, we think it goes one way. It's like this senior person is providing, filling this empty vessel. But it really is a working alliance, a professional working alliance. That's what I like about your together. And then it has a very specific personal and career. Because if it's just personal, that's a friend. And if it's just career, it might be your boss. So really, and there is a term called supervisory mentoring, but it needs both of those. And then it's success of these partners, so it is talking about their goals, but there's benefits for both parties. Something to think about. So then the question is, but what is in that box, right? So we've kind of taken this little journey, and here is what the research had said. And after all of this, I decided, well, maybe it's not a box. That the context seemed really important for these programs. When you start thinking about programs, and not necessarily the disciplinary context, but the context in terms of what do the protege and mentors come into that relationship with? What's their background, their values, their expectations, maybe prior mentoring experiences. Because if they've had some negative ones, they might have some expectations that are different. And then what is that context, especially for formal programs? The program manager, how you're establishing those goals, the pace of change. I mean, COVID has certainly made all of us probably think a little bit differently about mentoring. Technology influences all of these relationships, and especially these norms, policies, and procedures, which talk about, come on in, about this idea of mentorship education and safety nets. And the other idea is that, we can have a mentor-like interaction without you being a mentor to me. But we can still have a mentor-like interaction, especially if you have a culture of mentoring in an organization. But it's those interactions over time that progress through these relationship stages that make us eventually believe that we're in mentoring relationships. And I finally wrote a book, and just actually came out the second edition, about how to make mentoring programs, because I realized people often want to jump in and match people and send them on their way without thinking very clearly about what's the goal. And when you see programs that don't work, it's often that they're doing things and talking about things, but not about what the person intended who started the program. So for example, retention programs. I've worked with a number of student retention programs in the United States, and they're wondering, why is it not better? And I'm like, well, what's the mentor-mentee talking about? And they're just talking about what they did this past weekend, which they might do and really like each other and have fun, or go see a game together. But they've not really talked about, what do you do if you're struggling in school? How do you access resources? Ideas about social capital. Where's the library? How do you download an article? I mean, these things are really important. So if they're not talking about the things that can help them stay in school, then mentoring in the terms and sense of what the program wanted isn't taking place. And so I decided that context, while mentors and mentees are important, context seems to be critically important in shaping that relationship. And so it will be no surprise that I've become quite interested in culture. And the work I'm doing at the University of Regensburg, they have this fantastic new mentoring program called Global Talent Mentoring, where they have partnered senior scientists, again, in STEM areas, science areas, with extremely gifted youth. I think they were all in high school when they started. There might have been a 14, or there's some young ones in there. So a few are in college now because it's just been going 1 year. And what we're doing is interviewing them to look at, they're all from different countries. You're not partnered with somebody from your country. The platform is all in English, so they have to interact in English. And we're examining, does power distance matter in terms of how they interact, and we're looking just at that initiation stage, the very first stage. So we picked pairs who are both high on power distance, very respectful. This is out of Hofstede's work. Some who are very low, like the US and Germany are quite low on power distance. I'd use your first name, and I wouldn't really, I've worked out in Germany, there's a lot of professor, doctor things, even though they're low also on power distance. But we're looking at how does this interact in terms of those relationships, and how can we understand those processes in the beginning. And so far we haven't finished all the interviews, but that rapport seems quite important, but honestly for some of them, they just dive right in and the rapport follows. So the question is, are there different paths? Maybe you do need both, but perhaps the order doesn't necessarily matter. Stay tuned for that. And then we're talking about working on a book for programs in STEM as well, trying to really pull together what is most effective in programs and how can that be shared or disseminated with others. And while it might be STEM focused, because that's where a lot of programs get going, it would certainly apply in other settings. So these are some plans I have, and it has been a pleasure to share some thoughts with you about mentoring, so I'll stop here and answer any questions or entertain comments that you have.
Thank you, Laura, for the insightful talk. So I think we can open the floor, and if you have any questions, comments, then please don't hesitate. And I forgot to mention that please serve yourself. Come here, take fruit and drink. And any questions from the audience?
Yes.
Okay. For those who don't know me, my name is An. I'm doing a PhD in English language education. And Professor Laura, thank you very much for a very, very interesting, very inspiring lecture. And because you just mentioned the idea of social capital, and I find that concept really captivating. Last week, Robert Putnam arrived in Budapest, and he gave a talk about his career and his famous book, Bowling Alone.
Yes.
And he described American society over the past century. And what he wants to emphasize is that from what is his observation, the American society has become more individualistic than community spirited, and that is the trend that he observed by looking at the membership from different organizations and over time series. So if he is right, then the American society is becoming more individualistic. And so why is the mentoring program in America is growing, in your experience?
Well, perhaps these ideas are related. And here is something I think people don't often think about. You have a program when people won't naturally find one another. So if you have a society that is quite connected through churches, for example, or service or civic groups, then you'll say, oh, well, An, I know you want to do this, so you need to go over here and talk to this person. But if it's very individualized and you're not part of those civic organizations, you have people arriving in work settings or university settings that may not know how to contact others or navigate that. So formal programs are because people, they don't think they would get together individually, on their own. That's why you would have an organization do that, whether it's for women. I think the other answer is also that in the US, we've become much more heterogeneous. So it was like, I grew up in a state where everyone looked like me. But now that is not the case. So we have had a huge influx of people from Latin America and Mexico, for example. The Raleigh-Durham area, which is my capital, we have 3 universities. I mean, it's multilingual, multinational. And that wasn't the case 50 years ago, for example. So I think this globalization in combination with the more individualized society has made it difficult to access. So therefore, people's solutions to some of these problems are mentoring programs to try to connect them in ways that, because otherwise they might not normally come in contact. This would be my thinking about that. What do you think?
Well, because you just say that gender and identity is becoming a big deal in America, and then how would you fix the tension between the individual identity and attracting them to join the mentoring program, and how the mentor can negotiate and mediate and provide support to those who become too individualistic?
Well, you know, it's interesting actually, because one of the programs I worked with in Arizona, there were faculty mentoring diverse students whose family, no one had gone to college, they were low income, etc. Now, if we'd asked these faculty to go to a diversity workshop and learn how to teach these students, they would never have attended. But they agreed to mentor. It kind of made them feel good. They would sign up, and we found that some of the benefits were faculty would say, wow, I didn't appreciate all of the challenges some of these students have. So I've changed how I teach. I've changed how I do some of my assignments. So I think in part the mentors also get educated about differences, and this is certainly true for women, we know that. That when men are actively asked to sponsor, I have a colleague in the United States mostly does work on men mentoring women, Brad Johnson, and talking about allyship, because then men learn more about the backgrounds. The fact is, you're not always going to have someone who could be a mentor who looks like you in your field. I mean, most of my mentors early on were men. The male professors were the ones who were full professor, for example. So even if you tried to have some of those matches on demographics, you can't always do that. It's a good question. Yes.
I would be interested in the disciplinary dimensions or the disciplinary issues, because you were also, like, you referred to it, but you were mentioning.
I never found any differences, other than there were some very modest differences in the graduate study, and there's someone named Biglin who talks about the disciplines in terms of hard sciences and soft, applied, not applied. Qualitatively, I think there's some work that suggests mentoring is more built in certain disciplines, the big lab sciences, for example. So if you have a bad mentor, there's a postdoc or somebody else who can kind of pick that up. Whereas some, like math or English, are very solitary. And so if your mentor is not all that great, then it's a problem. But increasingly, other than that, I'm not persuaded there are disciplinary differences.
Well, that's good.
I think it is good. And even this global talent mentoring, these interviews we've been doing with these scientists, I think it's more that there is a discipline of science or at the academy that seems to overtake any other cultural differences, for example. So other than it's more built in, so that really you have more of a safety net in certain disciplines, I think there's little evidence that it is different. And in the beginning, I did not think that. I wasn't sure.
Can I have another question?
Okay.
So I'm not trying to monopolize Laura, so please take a chance. But I'm wondering now, because you've done research and faculty mentoring, right? And now you are turning into talent mentoring. You go back to the original research focus, which is talent mentoring, research and talent mentoring, and of course it's a different constellation. So I'm just wondering whether you can, whether there is any sort of kind of like lessons learned, so to say, ideas or practices or findings which are applicable in the faculty mentoring context and vice versa. So, or there you say there is a firewall. And whatever you do with faculty,
No, I don't think that. I think for programs, there is a very specific kind of way you need to work it through, and it starts with those goals. And I find I've done a lot of workshops that people struggle on that. So for example, I was recently at a university consulting with them on their faculty mentoring program. They want to have faculty mentoring, their boss is all in favor, and I said, okay, faculty mentoring for what reason? Well, we want them to be successful here. Okay, successful at what? Because that's going to suggest what you do. And they really struggle with that question. And then they said, well, we want minority faculty to feel comfortable. Okay, do you feel they're not comfortable now? Is there something different for them than for your other faculty? And then they said, well, no. And so I think that the goal thing is so important and people skip over it a lot. And so if you really get clarity on that, then you recruit the right people, the mentors and mentees all know what they're there for. This is one of the biggest things that I see. The other is this idea of high quality or effective mentorship. I think people don't talk enough about that. They think high quality means I have to do all these great things. Even great mentors have bad days. And people don't think about that. I've seen talks where people get this laundry list and I'm like, well, who is that way? I mean, I really don't know anyone that way. And so really thinking of it as a skill and this idea of high quality, I think, is transferable. And I'm kind of seeing that as very interesting in the global talent mentoring when we're talking to the professors. They don't always talk about culture with their mentees. We very specifically ask them about that. But they are aware of the differences. And I think the other thing very effective mentors do, and I saw this in the Australian study, is they adapt their style. So they don't have one way to be. I think good mentors maybe have one way to be, but really excellent mentors are able to go, oh, my mentee probably needs this. So I don't know if that's what you're asking
Yes,
about.
I was just thinking, about the power dynamics, because in my thinking, although I have not been involved in talent mentoring, as what the people or colleagues at Binghamton do, but I'm just, because it's kind of like you have somebody who's very, senior, experienced, prestige, and then you are there as the mentee.
Yes, and sometimes you're quite young.
Yes, and then the same happens in a university.
Yes.
I think when you are a PhD student eventually, or when you are a junior faculty, and there is this power dynamic. And I'm just wondering whether there are any practices or any, findings which confirm that there are indeed, similarities in terms of how people work with each other, or whether this sort of distance or these power relationships get just, normalized.
Right.
And then they can just work together so easily.
Well, it'll be interesting when we finish the analysis. I mean, anecdotally right now, we asked them in 3 ways because we did not trust. So we know their country they're from. So we know what the power distance score is. We actually have them take a 5-item inventory at the end of the interview to assess their power distance. And I can tell you now, they almost all are on that low power distance. But then we took those items and we turned them into everyday questions, like how often do you ask your mentee for feedback? Because this is a person from a higher position shouldn't ask from a lower position. And we haven't coded all those yet, so I'm quite interested to see how are they going to line up with each other.
So that's an interesting question, actually.
Well, and we were quite interested in the power dimensions, and some research in the literature says that matters, that power distance matters, but it's all been in the organizational leadership when they looked at national companies, people from different countries interacting, that seemed important. It'll be interesting to see. Yeah. Yes.
One question first. In terms of change management, so you want to institute a mentorship program within an institution, whether it be a professional or a higher education institution, for example. How do we go about selling people on this idea? How do we get them to understand the value of mentorship as a two-way street? And when it comes to, for example, compensation of time, because there's a large investment that's required,
Yes.
Where does that come from? How do we make sure that there is no perception of loss of time or loss of income when, for example, university lecturers are so busy
Right.
already, how do we fit that in? How do we get that to a point where mentorship becomes a natural progression, where it's expected and fulfilled?
I have 3 answers to your one question. I think it's easier to make the case in corporate organizations. And the reason is you can do a return on investment. So if you show that this mentoring program, you can do a pilot and it keeps one more person from quitting, and you do the calculation on the salary, and usually the mentoring program is cheaper than that. So they do that math and they're typically willing to invest. So honestly, I think it's often easier to do that in a for-profit company, especially if you're having some turnover. But I'm working with a company, a big pharmaceutical company right now, and this is one of the challenges. Everybody's excited about mentoring, but they 9-month program and they wanted to meet 4 times. I'm like, that's not enough. But they're worried about the higher level people, their time, and they're very conscious about time. So we talked about, okay, we'll call something a shadowing experience. They were on board with that. Like, so I helped the HR person reframe some of the mentoring interactions in ways that were then very understandable. And people were like, okay, I'm willing to meet. I'll do a shadowing in addition to these 4, right? Well, that's really another mentoring meeting. So I think companies are easier because it's easy to calculate people's salaries and how much specifically. Here's how much half hour their time is. Here's that. I think that's easier. Educational institutions like universities are very difficult, and I often hear people say, "I'm already really busy, and it's one more thing I have to do." I didn't show you some of the studies where, with some colleagues, we actually looked at all the documents about faculty promotion to examine them and see, does it say you're supposed to be a mentor? And often. They're in job descriptions, not always in promotion rules, even for institutions that believe that. So I think there needs to be better alignment in universities about what the role of professors are, because when it's very clear, well, mentoring is part of your job and you have to help them see, if you get more skilled at it, some things will be better, but it's not an add-on. It's when people see it as an addition, and they're quite right, then to say, hey, I don't really have time for this. But that means you need to create a culture of mentoring, and that has to both come from the top and also be rewarded. So aligning, and I often look at, when I go into universities, the first thing I do is ask for their tenure and promotion documents and search for the word mentor. And when I don't see it, I'm like, I know you already have a problem. They're already going to say this is extra stuff. So until you can align that or have it be rewarded, it is probably, the people who are wanting to do it will do it, and the other people are not. I had a third part. Thank you, question mark. This is the 5 steps on programs, and this mapping your theory of change and getting buy-in from stakeholders. I think when you're trying to create a program, people often forget that. Like do you know what a logic model is? Does anyone know what that is? There's a visual representation of your program, and I'm happy to send you, there's Kellogg Foundation has a wonderful free resource on that. But if you get it on one page and you shop it around, you get agreement with stakeholders, this makes a big difference to getting people on board. And so you have to talk to other people. I once was, I think it was Palo Alto, one of the national labs in the United States. I went to a presentation, they described their program. It sounded great. I'm sitting there going, this is the best program ever. And then she says, and then we recruited, they had like 100 mentors. It was awesome. And she said, but the problem is, guess how many mentees they had sign up? 0, none. She had created this whole incredible sounding program, but she'd never actually asked the mentees what they wanted. So because it didn't meet their perceived need, they're like, well, I don't have time for that. it sounds great, but I don't have time for that. So that is a very important step to getting buy-in. And I was, a good thing for me to share in talks like this. I'm like, really, you didn't even get like one person? She was like, no, 0. So I think checking with stakeholders is really quite important for when you're trying to make change. And mentoring is an intervention. A program is an intervention. I don't say that when I go to work, right? Faculty don't want to feel like they're being intervened on, but they are interventions to help people perform better.
Can I? Sorry, I came from, I'm not familiar with mentoring, but I would like to know that which kind of criteria, general criteria, are used for selecting or recruiting mentors?
They absolutely should know the goal of your program and have enough competency if they're a mentor to fulfill that. If they're a mentee, they need to have some need that program is going to meet. That is number one. So I think part of doing a good job on recruiting is that kind of self-selection. Preparing them, absolutely there needs to be some sort of mentorship education, that they understand clearly the goals of the program, that you have some assurance about how the process is going to work, how to ask reflective questions. Otherwise, you might get a lot of what Andy Hobson calls judge mentoring or war stories that mentees don't want to hear or may not be relevant. So preparing them on really asking reflective questions and the ethics seems quite important.
Also, is the limitations of the support of mentor give to the mentees?
What do you mean by are there limitations?
Limitations mean which kind of extent do the mentors help their mentees?
Do you mean do this, try this,
Yeah,
that kind of thing? A lot of the research says it's much better if they do not say things like that, if instead they ask. What options do you see how to achieve your goal here? And help them think through for themselves or access people in their network rather than telling them to do this or that.
There was another question. Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm interested in this collaborative mentorship, because you always talk about mentor and the mentee, and I'm just interested in your experience. Have you established these kinds of collaborative mentorship in any programs that you have? Because also informally, there can be that you have more mentors, of course, and also in another way around when you have more mentees, and there are of course purposefully established system where you try to match not only two people but more than two people. And so mainly what are your experiences about this?
Sure, it's a great question. Even with programs I work with that have the one-on-one, I really encourage them that part of the job is to help the mentee have a network. And I think the way organizations are today, the network is very important, and we've been talking about mentoring is often embedded, and there's lots of supports, in a bigger program. So we talk one-on-one, but you really want to be encouraging people to have a network. And I think how the program is built out depends on the organization. So I've worked, for example, with a bank. They had all these strange, trendy names for things, but it was essentially a group peer mentoring program. They called it like the squad, and they had a squad lead, and all this stuff. But it was essentially a mentor, and they had 5 mentees. So you both had some peer mentoring and, near peer mentoring because it was just one level above. And those can be very effective. And then we talked some about reciprocal mentoring. And I think once you have a program and a mentoring culture, you get much more informal mentoring happening. And companies also have reported that. So once people have an idea about what it's supposed to look like, it does tend to emerge. So I think the reality is people are in, even these faculty in some of those studies, senior faculty reported often having mentors because they're trying to figure out how to transition to the next phase. I think mentoring is most important at transitions. When we have these needs, and we're trying to figure out what that looks like. So I think most people have a network. And being deliberate about that network is important. In fact, there's an exercise, I should have brought it. I often have people do when I do workshops to help them think about their network. Like, what are their goals? Who has supported them across the top? And then which of those people can help them with those goals? And often there's some gaps, like, oh, I need to do this thing, and people I rely on, nobody knows how to do this. So they need to find someone to add to their board of advisors, for example.
You had another question, right?
I have lots of questions, but
Oh.
so, for example, I live with a student who's with this university, and he would greatly benefit from a mentorship program. And I'm aware that we offer such mentorship programs, but he refuses to connect and doesn't see the value for himself. How do we go about engaging when we've got programs? You mentioned the idea of asking students what they need, but you can't lead a horse to water and make it drink. Right now, the horse is going in that direction. The water's there. How do we show that value? He's fairly new to the institution, so he doesn't really. And he's young. He doesn't know what he doesn't know. So how do we do this? How do we bridge that gap?
Well, I have a very controversial answer for you. I should have started my talk by saying sometimes I say things you won't like. Let me ask you this question. How many of you think everyone is mentorable? Raise your hand if you think that. Yeah. Like, okay. Well, I don't think that. What about coachable? Do you think everybody's coachable? See, people, when you ask coaching, they're kind of like, oh, okay, maybe not. But mentoring, yes. When I've looked at programs, that's a study I haven't yet done, but I often find between 15 and 20% of people in programs really don't report having a mentor. They're not engaging. And there's lots of places, like I've been to the U.S. Military West Point, they require mentoring, and when they told me that, I'm like, and how's that go? Like, really, how's that go? And they're like, okay, we do have people who don't want that. And I theorize there are a set of personality constructs that some people simply are not mentorable. They do not wish it. I've met very talented people. I've sometimes at talks when I've said this, I'll have one person come up and whisper to me that they're that person. Does it mean that they can't grow professionally? No, it does not mean that. There maybe are other professional development opportunities that would be right for them, but I think some people don't want it. And if they don't want it, we could speculate as to why, but I think they have to perceive that value or it doesn't work. So I don't think everybody's mentorable, which does not make me very popular at certain mentoring conferences, I will just say that. So anyway, that would be my answer to you. Give it time. Maybe, but maybe not. Yes.
My question is a bit related. So if it's related to personality, is it also related to context or culture? I mean, the capability of being mentored or being open or towards collaboration. Do you think that?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, perhaps we could argue some cultures promote mentoring-like behaviors. I was just grilling on here about Vietnam, for example, where he's from. So, but I don't know about that because there's probably some mentor-like. I mean, I've looked in other cultures, not all of them, obviously, but like take Japan. I've studied martial arts, and you have this sensei relationship that it's prototypical kind of mentoring relationship. It might look a little different, but most. There's Anansi, the spider in West African tradition, or in the Hopi, also interestingly, you have Spider Woman, but there's these myths about, and they're all like mentoring. So I don't know that cultures may or may not promote that, which is different because those are learned, which is different than personality, which is relatively fixed and difficult to change. And if I was going to guess, I would guess it's about maybe attachment, so perhaps less secure people. I started a study on that, didn't finish it. Maybe some openness. I don't know. There's some people who try to tie personality, but it's a small part. But I wonder what's going on with those people. Culture? I don't know. I mean, are there cultures that have no mentoring? Like even cultures that we might not like, or they have probably mentoring is happening somehow. Maybe it looks different. I don't know. Good question. I think we have time for one more, yes.
Yeah.
Actually, thank you for your interesting question. To be honest, I'm not familiar with this kind of mentoring programs because I came from another country. In our country, we don't have this kind of mentoring program. But from literature, I know about this mentoring program. Mentoring program is, I just have very limited understanding of this mentoring program. I just understand like mentoring program is just facilitating new employee by experienced employee. But now I saw some definition you made, like I don't remember the exact definition, but it's kind of professional working awareness.
Yes.
So it's a kind of collaboration. Mentoring can be a kind of collaboration. So from my previous understanding of mentoring program, I just see only the benefits of mentee from the mentoring program. But now in this new definition, we can see the benefits of mentor because they are working together. So what kind of benefits they can get? I mean, mentor get from this mentoring program. Maybe
Well, mentors often, again, thinking about the developmental psychosocial, so when we get to a certain age, like maybe my age, you want to give things back. You want to help others. We call it legacy. So people actually get quite a bit of personal satisfaction from helping other people like they were helped. So, and we should not underestimate that can be a very strong psychological motivator for people. But there's also very tangible benefits they can get. I mean, we were just talking about a mentoring program here, and I would call it maybe some reverse mentoring, but sometimes your mentees know things about technology or some other things that you don't know. And so you can actually learn some very concrete things from mentors, your mentee. And some lab sciences especially, graduate students might come out and they've learned some latest technologies on things that their mentor may not be familiar with. And this is true in even psychology. It might be some new, my advisor his eyes would roll in the back of his head when you talked about multi-linear SEM models. He's like, can somebody run that for me, right? So there's some tangible. The other benefits are mentors. When you mentor other people, you kind of get a group of people who will be your supporters. So especially in companies or in the academy, like now you're in a meeting and you're going to vote on something, well, maybe they're more likely to vote with you, you mentored them. So there are a number of benefits in this way. Also reward and recognition. So in some places, people are more likely to be promoted because they're seen as able to develop other people. That may not be true everywhere, but those are also. And then there's some things like I mentioned from the one mentoring program. They learn more about diversity. So there were some important things they learned that they would not have ever gone to a workshop on, for example.
Thank you.
What country are you from?
I come from Myanmar.
Yemen?
Myanmar.
Myanmar, okay. See, I would think Myanmar has some. We're going to have to ponder that. We're going to research that. Thank you so much.
Thank you for all the questions
Yes.
and answers.